Okay, hello, and thank you for coming. My name is Mateusz Lenart, and I am Creative Art Director at Bloober Team, Krakow. Our last game is Layers of Fear, a psychedelic horror about a painter trapped in his own demented reality. If you don't know the game, I think I can show one of the trailer. Sorry, there is no sound. Sorry.
This house is absolutely amazing.
Okay, there are some new person here, so maybe I will start over. Hello and thank you for coming. My name is Mateusz Lenart and I am Creative Art Director at Bloober Team, Krakow. Our last game is Layers of Fear, a psychedelic horror about a painter trapped in his own demented reality. If someone don't know the game, maybe I can show one of the trailer.
This house is absolutely amazing. How about that smile? All right. The undercoat should be dry by now. It's time to get to work. Hello? Yes, speaking. Ugly. Ugly? You ordered a true portrait, so that's what I painted, you fucking pleb. The clock struck 1. The horde ran down.
Okay, let's jump again to presentation. You probably don't know me, so here a couple of words about me. Since 2007, I've been doing graphics for games. I've worked in several companies in Poland, going through a typical career steps of a graphic artist. I've worked as a concept artist, 3D graphic, character modeler, lead level designer up to the art director at Bloober Team. After work at DD Interactive, this is my second company when I work at that position. At DD when I worked for 3 years. I also worked in advertising and TV station TVN, doing video editing for movies and compositing, matte painting, etc. I prepared this presentation with Michał Król, game designer at Bloober Team, earlier game journalist, who prepared the English version of the presentation and wrote a few points from level design chapter. Okay, so what I will be talking about. In the talk, I will try to shed some light on how we look at the games from the psychedelic horror genre. I'm talking here on purpose about psychedelic because, in my opinion, it requires a completely different approach than, for example, a typical survival horror. I will talk about the general topic of art directing when creating these types of games, how to approach the topic in order to stand out from the crowd, as well as why the topic and the overall concept are so important, how graphics influence the reception of the game, lead the player, and direct the gameplay using lighting and composition, why choosing the right idea and the graphical elements means so much. Of course, all the conclusions and truths that I will present here are totally subjective, but this will guide us when creating a similar game in the future, which we actually do. Okay, for me, the most important thing in creating a psychedelic horror is the theme and idea. It's all about how to not make another mental asylum. Good idea makes us visible at the market. One of the most important things when creating a horror, but also when creating other games, is the right idea, of course. Currently, horrors have once again become a really popular. I think because of the phenomenon of PT and the success of other titles like Five Nights at Freddy's, Outlast, Alien Isolation. Horror games are flooding the Steam market and fighting for our attention. But when I look at many of these titles, I see the one thing really stands out, obvious lack of unique selling points proposals. In my opinion, it's the only chance to make it big on the market without a support of a huge budget. The main problem for me is cliché. For years, people have been frightened by the same things over and over. Abandoned houses, hospitals, basements, etc. It's a natural human reaction. We are afraid of death, the paranormal, darkness, solitude. Does this mean we can refer to these things? I think no, but if we don't want our idea to get lost in the sea of other haunted houses games, we need to find a proper trick. Horror only works when it can surprise the player, and it does that best not by putting him to yet another asylum, but by putting him in a place where the horror is least expected. It all boils down to good design and a reasonable way of directing your product. For years, people have been scared of the same thing, so the key to success for me is to simply add the one crucial change. I like to call it added value. That will cause the game will be recognizable just after seeing a single screenshot or after seeing a single trailer. Those can be different things like a new mechanic, original gameplay, but here I will concentrate on interesting concepts for games. Of course, I'm ignoring here the aspect of quality, as a poorly executed project won't stand a chance in the ocean of mediocre titles. Okay, let's look for a moment at a few titles that got quite positive feedback in a horror game community. Of course, Outlast, ordinary settings with one new thing, the camera with night vision, game looks freshly on the screenshots, and with a pretty good gameplay is enough. IB, a simple 2D horror game which takes place at an abandoned art gallery, where every exhibit may feel the urge to turn your character into the next abstract work of art. One of my favorite ideas, Among the Sleep, a FPP horror where you take control of a terrified kid experiencing the nightmares from his tiny perspective. And of course, Five Nights at Freddy's, practically a resource management game where our main enemies are bloodthirsty animatronics from pizza chains. Okay, but how to find that added value? One of my personal favorites is a method used by the advertising industry, which is based on finding inspirations in things that seemingly have nothing in common with the topic we are trying to tackle. I call it intelligent mix. Advertising can teach us a lot about finding the right inspiration in places no one would even think to look for. If you want to make an ad for a washing powder, then don't go watch all the washing powder commercials out there. Don't go finding your ideas in the washing room and want to get a good idea with that. Instead of that, grab the first magazine lying around. It can be, for example, an issue of a National Geographic, and start scanning. Your subconscious will begin generating connections with the topic you are dealing with. For example, looking at the polar bear, you might simply see an animal, but if you notice his white fur while thinking about the washing powder, and then you compare it to a brown grizzly bear, for example, you may have a pretty good idea. Start of pretty good idea. Here are some better examples from advertisements. Chupa Chups, Tabasco, Nugget Shoe Polish, and the History Channel. One of my favorite concept artists, Feng Zhu, in his GDC talk, mentioned about this method of combining two different motives in order to achieve something outstanding. Doing what the advertisers do, but by asking themselves the questions, what if? And for example, combining a pyramid with a snowy lands or a Japanese temple with a barren desert. Things like that seem obvious, but you really need to keep them in mind and stick to the plan. When creating layers of fear, we encountered the same problem, because at first our task was to create a digital haunted house, another digital haunted house. We quickly realized that this is not enough, this won't be enough, and we desperately need to mix some unique themes with the core gameplay. So, what if we were to play as an artist trapped in his own house, distorted by his demented and sick mind? Thanks to that fresh combination, we were able to later build everything around art, paintings, and characteristic architecture. All right, so we have the idea. What next? What about the production and art directing? When the main theme and concept are, why the main theme and concept are so important? Because the leading idea behind the game sets its every aspect, broadens the perspective, and gives an approach to the topic. I will take Layers of Fear as an example. When we first started thinking about our game in terms of painting, that's when we changed our entire perspective of the game. The idea predestines the future decision that shape the game and set the direction. It suggests the art style and gameplay, causing all decisions making to become easier. It had influence. It had influence in everything, even the first teaser. I can show you that. Sorry. I'm not using Mac, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so the first teaser.
Lady with an ermine. More than half a millennium old. One of 4 portraits of women painted by Leonardo da Vinci. Oils on a dark wooden panel. Many believe the ermine implies purity, moderation, but it is almost alien in appearance. Blackish, rat-like, rabid, abhorrent. It complements the darkness of the woman's hollowed eyes. Dark paints like blood mixed with charcoal, drowning and suffocating. The ugliness beneath the surface is seething, ready to burst like a reeking boil. Do you see it now? Do you see it like I do?
Okay. The teaser, as you see, doesn't have any gameplay in it, but it had a actually. That's the same. Sorry. The teaser have absolutely no gameplay, but it had a pretty good feedback because everyone noticed that this is something new and maybe it's interesting. Do you see it do you see it now? Do you see it like I do? This was the key frames. Our goal is to make the player feel like a painter because we are going through a psychedelic horror, you remember. Okay, so we have the idea. What next? One thing to remember once you have the idea and all the fundamentals down, for me, is don't go too far. The good balance of realism and abstraction. This influences how we construct spaces. It's all about crafting stimuli for the player in such a way that there is always a method to surprise him. Less is more, would say advertisement designers. That's why you need to have your game correctly grounded, create an environment to which the player can relate to, understand, and accept. The task of the developers is to evoke a certain emotional state in the player, deciding how to make him feel and get immersed in all the things he is experiencing. In Layers of Fear, it was letters, paintings, realistic rooms. The key to do that is to create a believable universe. The player's lack of acceptance for the world turns him into a bystander, someone who is only interpreting the fictional world or something as something untrue. Unreal and abstract elements in real, simple and consistent world have a much greater impact. A well-grounded game in space, consistency and attention to detail, those are the key elements of a horror game, especially the psychedelic horror. It's all about consistency of the world. It must be believable and immersive. To achieve this, we need to come under certain rules. Here are a couple, here in my opinion are some of them. Simple, true, base environments. Based on Layers of Fear, we decided for the good of the atmosphere to, since we went for a painter, to go back to a time when the craft of painting had much more value than nowadays. That is why we went for a Victorian style. From this point, many important decisions have risen. As we know, the Victorian style is characteristic for its eclecticism and the overabundance of ornaments, especially in the mid-Victorian period from 1950 to 1975. An interesting example of this that shows our approach to is one of the main assets from Layers of Fear. The elements of the environment in the form of the walls, doors, ceiling, and floorboards. During the production, we created the concept of 3 different sets for our game environment. The one that was chosen in the end had a very simplistic form with wood that added a bit of a personal feeling to it. This simplicity works in contrast to supernatural events. By going with the sets, with the set, we were able to emphasize all the stimuli that were coming at the player from all around him. With our concept for a constantly changing environment, we could not afford detailed setting as it would quickly tire the player. Okay, here are other examples of used assets in Layers of Fear. A small architecture that supplements the concept and enriches the world. The player doesn't necessarily need to know if everything comes from a specific time period. It's all about keeping all the overall feeling right, so that the player can understand the atmosphere we are trying to present to him. At one point in the production, we had a list of medicines that were from contemporary times. We just could not allow something like that to slip by. One of my favorite examples of well-designed game is BioShock. Art Deco style mixed with steampunk. This game is very characteristic and everything is driven by its artistic direction. Okay, we are jumped now to convincing light and colors. This is another good example where the main concept sets the entire production. In case of Layers of Fear, the inspiration were pretty obvious. It was difficult not to use what the theme was handing us on a silver platter. The most influential part of our inspirations was how painters used lighting and colors in creating the heavy dark mood masterworks. It is best seen in the dark art from the Baroque painting made by Goya, Caravaggio, or Rembrandt. Similarly to the painting of masters, as is in the Calling of St. Matthew, for example, from Caravaggio, the composition and lighting imposes a certain way we look at the painting, just as we use composition and focus points to guide the player where we want him to go and look. Basically, it's just like with the painting. Our eye goes to the lit places, contrasted areas, and mismatched objects. Another element is music. I cannot forget to mention here about the role of the music. I would not develop this theme at the moment, but of course it's important to understand that in this case, It is the case with the visuals, and the music and SFX also plays a vital role in keeping the atmosphere and the overall reception of the game together. Okay, and now my beloved part. Break the rules. This is the true meaning of why it is fun and why it is good to have a solid fundamentals at the beginning. Once we have all of the elements in place, there is the time to start bending and breaking the rules, to push that believable reality, deny it, so it's so that the player will start feeling uncomfortable. We are letting the player get used to the fact that even though the surroundings seem realistic, they may be false, and that no rules apply to them, so nothing can truly be predicted. In Layers of Fear, we take our time to let the player get accustomed with the surrounding environment. Each new added thing becomes a surprise. At first, the player gets familiarized with the surrounding by exploring the house. He searches every nook and cranny and starts believing that he may have missed something. And then when he is about to leave, everything around shifts into unknown territory. At one point, players even encounter an elevator, which only emphasizes the feeling of something like, oh God, how huge is that house? We slowly but gradually start introducing more and more elements that keep breaking the reality. For example, melting paintings, melting structures, unbelievable spaces, black tar-like formations swallowing the area. Many ideas were taken from the works of great artists. Paint and detached from reality environment was inspired by Adrian Gagne. Our antagonist was inspired by contemporary artist Oliver de Sargassian. Okay, let's go to the final stage of my speech. Level design is one of the most important things in creating a psychedelic horror like Layers of Fear. This is something more than a composition of walls, floors, and furnitures. Here we connect everything together. I would like to mention a few points of that seem to us to be crucial to building a good horror game. Enviro storytelling, amplitude of fear, and problems with linearity. Enviro storytelling. The composition of space that leads the player. Our focus is to use elements of space to build up a relation with the player and to lead his action in a directed way. Human brains are naturally weird to look for correlations in everything they see. This same goes for the player, who will try to find meaning in everything they stumble upon, because to them there is no such thing in a game as a coincidence. Narratively, we build a scene and accustom the player that everything that surround him may have a reason to be there. As a result, even random objects become an essential part of the plot for the player. More than that, in consistently builded world, players immediately captures the things that do not fit into it. An example from Layers of Fear are various items and 3D objects that we made strictly for the purpose of filling up the gargantuan amount of empty drawers. One of the items, war medals, that had nothing to do with the game story at first, was actually turned by the player into something significant. The fans thought that because there were so medals in drawers, that the protagonist must be a traumatized war veteran who lost his leg during the war. Unpredictability. In Layers of Fear, there is absolutely no safe zones for the player, in his mind, of course. In a horror game, the environment is your best weapon against the player's sense of security. In Layers of Fear, our best element was the ever-changing environment, which drove some players to a ridiculous paranoia, where they couldn't even trust their own senses, because they never knew what might have changed when they weren't looking in a certain direction. I can show you one of the examples. If I can jump from this. Okay. Okay. Our goal was to take away from the player the feeling that a room, something solid and constant, is his safe zone, and force him to start feeling dread when exploring every areas. Besides, you can really go creative and crazy with how change destroyed shift the levels in order to make the player feel unsafe with each step he takes. Amplitude. This is another element of good level design for me. Amplitude directed like in the movie, to building up and releasing the tension. At its core, horror works exactly the same way as comedy. First, you build up the tension, like setting up the premise of a joke. Then you make the player expect a certain outcome, and in the end, you turn that expectations upside down. A cheap jump scare is like a punchline without a joke. It has to be earned in order to feel good. In Layers of Fear, we often were prized for center scares because of how they built up to that final release of tension. Most of the good ones had fake scares, which were just there to turn the player attention away from the actual jump scare. Example, the book ghost. That's we called it. Player attention is directed at the exposed painting. He expects something to scare him there. The painting violently melts, but this only works as a distraction. It could even give some false tension release, which is the moment of intensifies the scare. But the true jump scare waits behind the player, ready to scare him where he is not even expecting that to happen. Similarly, like with any good joke, overusing the same scare tactic strips it from its initial surprise, making it quickly predictable and irritating. While this is obvious for scare mechanics, being chased by the same monster through the entire game, and using the same cheap jump scare, etc., is also true for environment art. We learned this with Layers of Fear. Occasionally, in some parts of the game, we use massive tower-like formations in order to make certain locations to look more creepy and unsettling. In the last chapter of the game, that visual effect is used through the entire chapter. But because of that overuse, it seemed to completely lose its effect by the end of the game. This is my opinion, the moment when we probably go too far. Problems with linearity. Linear gameplay can be a problem of narrative, sometimes no matter how well you try to sell the environment. In Layers of Fear from the very beginning, we went for more modular structures of the game, of the gameplay. In the end, this left us with a structure of linearly connected rooms. This had negative impact later in the game when the player starts feeling that they are being dragged from one scare to another. This also hinders explorative narrations. Most of the story in our game is being told through the scattered notes and mementos, which the player has to gather and piece together. This method of telling a story works wonders in a more open environment, where the player has many side paths to explore, but in an extremely linear structure, it loses its magic. We struggled with this, cleverly hiding fabular objects and creating short side paths of the story. Often players have to go through the game several times to discover all the secrets of the room. It may be funny to hear, but at first the game was not linear and the player could choose at least 2 tracks always. Linear gameplay decisions stemmed from the time that we had to create the game and the fact that a large part of the players skirted up to 60% of the content, which was a big problem in 4 hours gameplay. There was some advantages also. Linearly gave us greater control over directing. We were able to quickly take control of the whole and block what could ruin reception. But overall, it was a thing that we want to improve in the future. Okay, and the last thing, but for me it's the most important, good taste. Everything goes with good intuition. During the production, there are hundreds of ideas, of which at least half of them lands in the basket before implementation. Everything comes back to determine a good foundation at the beginning. That's why we believe that references such as the movie series Saw are not the best source of inspiration for us. It all boils down how supply you can play with the certain motives and effects without making them feel stale. Even gore, when used at the right moment, can greatly boost the atmosphere of a segment. The hanging fridge from a PT is a good example. The demo rarely plays with gore, so which is why the moment along with the bloody fetus have such an impact during the game. We have to be very careful to choosing that kind of ideas. Of course, this doesn't mean that if something was once used, it should never be used in a horror again. Even cliches can be good when used creatively, but it is risky. In Layers of Fear, one of many cliches we use were creepy dolls, which we tried as hard as possible to use in freshly psychedelic ways. Every time we were going to place a doll in a room, we wondered how we can make it feel different, although that didn't always have the desired effect. One example is a big doll face after ending the child room. This effect had a pretty good impact from the player, but for me it will be always a cheap moment. I remember another idea, a room without floor where steps jumps up from the darkness in a certain area. Level was built up, but after all we deleted it. Feeling of space, fear of heights work well, but the whole level began to resemble type of games like Uncharted or Lara Croft. Instead of that, we created the office room, which was based on similar feeling, but everything in this idea was suited to the psychedelic style of our game. Summarizing, there is no recipe to create a good psychedelic horror. In my opinion, the most important thing is for sure a good taste. In terms of production, the most important thing is have a good team and idea that not only makes us visible at the market, but simplifies the production and makes the answers to the questions during the production become logical and obvious. This is end. Thank you. Sorry for the problems. Maybe you have some questions. I will try to answer if you want. Or maybe not. Okay. Sorry, there is some microphone somewhere.
Hello.
Hello, hi.
Hi, I'm Greg, and I would like to ask about, as a creative art director with a complete idea of the visual aspect of the game and the game design, how often do you have to struggle with opinions of non-artistic management crew opinions based on trade arguments, and eventually how do you manage these issues?
It's a funny question because I didn't have to struggle with that kind of problems, because I don't know. I think we all trust each other, and when with Bartosz Kapron, for example, which is the man who graduated Academy of Fine Art, just like me, and when we go through, when we find a idea of what to use and how to put that in the game, then actually no one have any argue to that. So I think there is no problems in it. We trust each other, and I think that's how I don't go into a pipeline of animators that don't go in my ideas, argue with me. Of course, there are many, talks about our game, that something is good or something is not good, but yeah, it wasn't a problem. It's the quick question. Okay, quick answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry?
How many artists?
How many artists? I have to count it. Our team is something like 60 people, but 60, 70, I don't know. 60, yeah? 60. And the graphic artists, how many of our team is a graphic artist? 20, maybe 20. We have 6 3D modeler. There is me. There are 6 level design artists, level design artists, and 3 concept artists. And basically, it's all. It was all the team from the graphical space. Okay, so I think it's done. Thank you very much.